170 years. All of that, of course, part of the state opening of Parliament. Now, the speech written by the government sets out the plans for the year ahead. Now, the proposed laws, they include things like tougher sentences for some crimes.
Seconds ago, King Charles just did the unthinkable. DNA results just confirmed what nobody dared to say out loud. Palace insiders are in absolute shock. Meghan's worst nightmare just became reality, and what these test results reveal will shake the royal family to its core. This isn't gossip. This isn't a theory. This is verified evidence that changes everything we thought we knew. For years, Meghan Markle operated with a level of strategic precision that caught many royal observers off guard. She understood the power of narrative control, the importance of public perception, and most critically, she recognized that the British monarchy had spent centuries perfecting the art of silent endurance.
Look, I was really ashamed to say it at the time, and ashamed to have to admit it to Harry, especially, because I know how much loss he's suffered. But I knew that if I didn't say it, that I would do it. And I just didn't.
According to multiple palace insiders who have spoken to various media outlets over the past few years, Meghan built her entire approach around one fundamental assumption. The royal family would never directly challenge her, no matter how strained the relationship became. This assumption was not unreasonable. The monarchy has historically chosen absorption over confrontation, preferring to weather storms quietly rather than engage in public disputes that could damage the institution's carefully maintained dignity. Former royal correspondents have noted that this pattern of behaviour goes back generations. When faced with scandal or controversy, the palace typically deploys what insiders call the never complain, never explain strategy, an approach attributed to Queen Elizabeth II herself. Meghan appeared to understand this institutional reflex and, according to sources close to the situation, built her confidence around it. The strategy worked remarkably well for several years. Every carefully crafted interview, every public appearance, every statement released through her representatives seemed designed to control the conversation while remaining just ambiguous enough to avoid direct contradiction. Royal experts who have studied her public communications noted a pattern of emotional appeals that resonated strongly with certain audiences, while making it difficult for the palace to respond without appearing cold or defensive. She positioned herself in a way that made any institutional pushback seem like an attack on a vulnerable individual rather than a legitimate response to contested claims. Behind the scenes, palace advisors reportedly urged patience and restraint. According to sources familiar with internal discussions, many senior figures believed that public attention would eventually shift, that controversies would fade with time, and that maintaining silence represented the safest path forward. This approach had worked before. The monarchy had survived far more direct attacks by simply refusing to engage, allowing critics to eventually exhaust themselves while the institution carried on unchanged. There seemed to be little reason to believe this situation would require a different response. However, what Meghan may not have fully anticipated was that institutional patience, while extensive, is not infinite. Sources close to the palace suggest that with each passing month, with each new interview or revelation, the calculation behind the scenes was slowly shifting. The cost of continued silence was beginning to outweigh the perceived benefits. Small cracks in the facade of unity were widening into visible fractures, and some advisors were quietly questioning whether the traditional approach remained viable in an age of constant media scrutiny and instant global communication. The emergence of DNA evidence changed everything overnight. This was not another interview that could be dismissed as a matter of interpretation. This was not a story that depended on competing narratives or differing perspectives. This was science, and science does not negotiate. According to reports from multiple sources within royal circles, the evidence did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation, but rather as the conclusion of a process that had been underway for some time, conducted with extreme discretion and known only to a tiny circle of trusted individuals. What made this evidence particularly devastating was its nature. Past controversies had relied on statements, emotions, and personal accounts, all of which left room for doubt, interpretation, and competing versions of events. DNA evidence operates in a different realm entirely. It provides answers with a level of certainty that makes denial effectively impossible. When the results were confirmed through multiple independent verifications, the palace found itself in unprecedented territory. This was no longer about managing perceptions or waiting for public interest to wane. This was about confronting verifiable facts that directly contradicted established narratives. Palace insiders who have spoken anonymously to various journalists described the atmosphere following the verification as one of controlled crisis. There was no panic, no visible chaos, but rather a profound shift in strategy that happened almost immediately. The old playbook was set aside. The assumption that silence would protect the institution was replaced by a new calculation. Silence would now be interpreted as weakness, or worse, as confirmation that there was something to hide. The evidence had fundamentally altered the equation. For Meghan, this represented a miscalculation of historic proportions. She had built her position on the belief that the monarchy would always prioritize institutional preservation over direct confrontation. She had wagered that the palace would absorb any amount of tension rather than risk the public spectacle of an open conflict. According to sources familiar with her thinking at the time, she trusted that royal restraint was essentially guaranteed, that the institution's fear of damaging its own reputation would function as an impenetrable shield protecting her from any serious institutional response. That belief appears to have been rooted in reasonable historical precedent. The monarchy had indeed demonstrated remarkable tolerance for internal discord over the years. It had endured public criticism, absorbed scandals involving its own members, and maintained a posture of dignified silence through crises that would have destroyed less resilient institutions. From the outside, it appeared that this pattern would continue indefinitely, that the palace would always choose discretion over disclosure, patience over provocation. But institutions, like individuals, have breaking points. According to multiple reports from royal correspondents, the DNA evidence represented that breaking point. It was not simply that the evidence contradicted Meghan's account of events, it was that the evidence threatened to expose inconsistencies that could not be explained away through careful language or strategic ambiguity. Once introduced into the conversation, this type of proof would demand answers that the palace could no longer avoid, providing without appearing complicit in deception. The response from Meghan's team, according to sources close to the situation, reflected genuine alarm. This was unfamiliar ground. Public relations strategies that had proven effective in the past suddenly seemed inadequate. Emotional appeals that had previously generated sympathy now risked appearing calculated or manipulative in light of scientific evidence. The tools that had worked so well for so long were proving ineffective against this new challenge. For perhaps the first time since the conflict began, Meghan found herself in a defensive position with limited options for counterattack. What made the situation even more precarious was the timing. The evidence emerged at a moment when public opinion was already divided, when questions about credibility were already being raised in various quarters, and when the initial wave of sympathetic coverage had begun to recede. The palace, whether through careful planning or fortunate timing, found itself with an opportunity to reshape the narrative at a point when audiences might be more receptive to alternative explanations. The window for action was narrow but significant. The shift in palace strategy became apparent not through dramatic announcements, but through subtle changes in tone and approach. According to royal observers who have tracked these developments closely, there was a newfound willingness to push back, to question assumptions, and to signal that not everything being said publicly would be allowed to stand unchallenged. This was not the palace of old, content to absorb criticism indefinitely. This was an institution that had decided, however reluctantly, that some battles could not be avoided without surrendering something essential. For Meghan, the realization that the palace would no longer reflexively choose peace over conflict appears to have come too late. She had built her entire strategy around an assumption that no longer held true, begottestats. Monarchy had discovered that in this particular case, the greater risk lay not in confrontation, but in continued passivity. That calculation, once made, could not be easily reversed. The institution had committed itself to a course of action that would inevitably lead to further escalation, and the only question remaining was how far both sides would be willing to go before reaching some kind of resolution. The transformation in King Charles was so sudden and so complete that even his closest advisors were reportedly caught off guard. For decades, he had cultivated a public image of thoughtful deliberation, of careful consideration before action, of a man who preferred dialogue to confrontation. Those who had worked with him over the years described someone who weighed every decision carefully, sometimes to the point of appearing indecisive. That version of Charles seemed to vanish the moment the day evidence was placed before him. According to sources who were present during the critical meetings that followed the verification of the results, the king's demeanour shifted in a way that stunned the room. There were no dramatic outbursts, no visible displays of anger or distress. Instead, what emerged was something far more unsettling, a cold, focused determination that seemed to override every instinct toward caution that had previously defined his approach. Royal insiders who spoke to various media outlets described it as witnessing someone flip a switch, moving from uncertainty to absolute clarity in the space of a conversation. The phrase that began circulating among palace staff in those early hours was striking in its finality. No reconciliation possible. Not now. Not ever. These were not words spoken in the heat of emotion, according to those who heard them. They were delivered with a kind of measured certainty that suggested a decision had been made at a fundamental level, one that would not be revisited or reconsidered regardless of what arguments might be presented. For an institution that had built its survival on flexibility and compromise, this represented a remarkable departure from standard operating procedure. What made this shift particularly significant was the speed with which it occurred. The traditional palace approach to crisis management involved extensive consultation, careful weighing of options, and usually a preference for the least confrontational path forward. Former royal aides have described decision-making processes that could stretch over weeks or even months, as various factions within the palace debated the best course of action. In this case, according to multiple reports, the decision-making timeline collapsed to a matter of hours. The king had seen the evidence, absorbed its implications, and made his choice with a decisiveness that left little room for debate. Senior advisors who had counseled patience and continued restraint found themselves effectively sidelined. Sources familiar with the internal dynamics suggest that Charles began consulting with a much smaller circle of confidants, individuals who were more aligned with direct action than with traditional palace diplomacy. This inner circle was reportedly tasked with preparing for confrontation rather than containment, with planning offensive moves rather than defensive strategies. The shift in personnel signaled clearly that the old approach had been abandoned entirely. The psychological transformation was perhaps most evident in how Charles began discussing the situation. According to insiders who have spoken to royal correspondents over the past months, his language changed dramatically. Where he had previously spoken about managing the relationship or finding common ground, he now talked in terms of boundaries, consequences, and institutional integrity. The personal dimension seemed to drain from his considerations, replaced by a focus on what the evidence meant for the monarchy as an institution and what precedent would be set by how he responded. This was not simply about hurt feelings or damaged family relationships. Multiple sources have indicated that Charles came to view the situation through a much wider lens. He reportedly became convinced that how he handled this crisis would define not just this moment, but his entire reign. Would he be remembered as the king who allowed the monarchy to be undermined through inaction, or as the one who took decisive steps to protect the institution regardless of personal cost? That framing appears to have crystallized his thinking and eliminated any remaining hesitation. The activation of what palace insiders describe as a crisis command structure happened with remarkable speed. Normal channels of communication and decision-making were temporarily set aside in favor of a more centralized, hierarchical approach. Information flow was tightened significantly, with access restricted to those directly involved in managing the response. This was not the typical palace operation where multiple departments and advisors might have input on significant decisions. This was something closer to a military operation, with clear lines of authority and rapid execution of decisions once made. What emerged from this restructured approach was a strategy that prioritized speed and control over consensus and caution. The palace had historically moved slowly, allowing time for thorough consideration and broad consultation before taking significant actions. In this case, according to sources familiar with the planning, the emphasis was on moving quickly enough to shape the narrative before it could be shaped by others. The king and his inner circle recognized that in the modern media environment, delay often meant losing control of the story entirely. The declaration of war, as it came to be understood within palace circles, was not a single statement or action, but rather a series of decisions that collectively signaled a fundamental change in approach. According to royal observers who have tracked these developments, there were subtle but unmistakable shifts in how the palace communicated, what information it chose to share or withhold, and how it responded to inquiries from media outlets. The overall message was clear. The monarchy was no longer in a defensive posture. It was prepared to take initiative and would not be deterred by concerns about public perception or family harmony. This represented a calculated gamble. The palace was well aware that direct confrontation carried significant risks. Public sympathy could shift unpredictably. Media coverage could amplify discord rather than resolve it. International observers might view the conflict as evidence of institutional instability rather than strength. Yet despite these risks, Charles and his advisors appear to have concluded that the alternative, continued passive absorption of attacks on the monarchy's credibility, carried even greater long-term danger. The decision to move forward aggressively was reportedly influenced by a recognition that the nature of the evidence changed the calculus entirely. In previous controversies, the palace could credibly argue that different people had different perspectives, that memories were imperfect, that intentions were misunderstood. With DNA evidence in play, those familiar ambiguities disappeared. There were facts now, verifiable and concrete. And those facts either supported or contradicted specific claims that had been made publicly. The palace could no longer hide behind diplomatic language or carefully crafted non-responses. King Charles appears to have embraced this clarity, however uncomfortable it made the immediate situation. According to sources close to his thinking, he came to see the evidence as providing a kind of moral authority for action that had been lacking before. He was no longer simply choosing to confront for strategic reasons. He could argue, at least internally, that he was confronting because the truth demanded it, because allowing verified falsehoods to stand unchallenged would compromise the integrity of the institution he had sworn to protect. This shift in self-perception may have been crucial to his willingness to pursue such an aggressive course. Royal commentators have noted that Charles has always been acutely conscious of his historical legacy and deeply concerned about how he would be judged by future generations. The DNA evidence appears to have resolved in his mind the tension between being seen as compassionate and being seen as weak. He could frame his actions as defending truth and institutional integrity rather than simply engaging in family conflict. The international dimension of the decision also weighed heavily in palace calculations. Sources familiar with the strategic discussions indicate that advisors were acutely aware that the world was watching, that other nations and institutions were drawing conclusions about the monarchy's stability and authority based on how this crisis was handled. A passive response might be interpreted as weakness, potentially encouraging further challenges or diminishing the monarchy's standing on the global stage. An assertive response, while risky, at least demonstrated that the institution retained the will and capacity to defend itself. As the strategy took shape, the focus shifted from whether to act to how to act most effectively. The palace began preparing for a sustained campaign rather than a single confrontation. According to insiders, this involved coordinating legal, communications, and diplomatic elements into a coherent approach designed to maintain pressure while minimizing vulnerabilities. The goal was not simply to win a single battle, but to establish a new equilibrium in which the monarchy's authority would be respected and its core narratives protected from challenge. What made this moment historically significant was not just the decision to confront, but the willingness to do so, knowing that relationships might be permanently damaged in the process. King Charles had spent years attempting to maintain family bonds despite growing tensions. The choice to prioritize institutional survival over family harmony represented a profound personal sacrifice, one that reportedly caused him genuine anguish even as he remained convinced it was necessary. The crown had chosen its course, and there would be no turning back. Prince Harry found himself in an impossible position, caught between forces that allowed no neutral ground. According to sources close to the situation, his initial reaction to the emergence of the DNA evidence was not anger or defiance, but something closer to paralyzed disbelief. This was not the conflict he had prepared himself to navigate. The battles he had anticipated were about media treatment, public perception, and institutional resistance to change. What he now faced was something far more concrete and far more devastating. A crisis rooted not in interpretation, but in verifiable scientific fact. The evidence placed Harry in a position where every choice carried profound consequences. To stand firmly with Meghan meant potentially severing what remained of his connection to the royal family and the institution that had defined his entire life until recent years. To align with the palace meant undermining his marriage and the partnership that had given him the courage to break away from royal constraints in the first place. According to insiders who have observed his struggle during this period, Harry seemed genuinely torn, unable to see a path forward that did not require sacrificing something essential to his identity. Private conversations during this time were reportedly strained and often unproductive. Phone calls were made to family members, according to sources familiar with the communications, but many of these attempts at dialogue ended in uncomfortable silence rather than resolution. The problem was not a lack of words, but rather the recognition that certain words once spoken could not be taken back. Every conversation carried the risk of saying something that would harden positions further or create wounds that could never fully heal. Messages were exchanged, meetings were tentatively scheduled, and then quietly postponed. According to palace insiders who spoke to various media outlets, there was a pervasive sense that everyone involved understood the gravity of the moment, but no one knew how to navigate it without making things worse. Harry found himself in the uniquely painful position of understanding both sides of the conflict while being unable to bridge the gap between them. He could see his father's perspective, the institutional pressures, and the need to defend the monarchy's credibility. He could equally understand his wife's position and her conviction that she had been treated unfairly by an institution resistant to change. What made the situation even more agonizing was the speed and melmothpaerton, which events were unfolding. Unlike previous royal controversies that developed gradually over months or years, this crisis seemed to accelerate with each passing day. Decisions were being made, positions were hardening, and the window for finding middle ground was closing rapidly. Harry reportedly felt overwhelmed by the pace of developments, unable to process one revelation before the next one emerged. Sources close to him during this period described someone who appeared emotionally exhausted, caught in a situation where any action or inaction would be interpreted as a definitive statement of loyalty. The pressure from both sides intensified as the crisis deepened. According to insiders, Meghan expected unwavering support, viewing the conflict as a clear test of where Harry's ultimate loyalty resided. From her perspective, this was not a complicated situation requiring careful navigation. It was a moment that demanded he stand beside her without qualification or hesitation. Any sign of uncertainty or any attempt to maintain connection with the palace could be interpreted as a betrayal of their partnership and the life they had built together away from royal constraints. Simultaneously, the palace was reportedly making its own expectations clear, though perhaps more subtly. There were no dramatic ultimatums or explicit demands for Harry to choose sides, according to sources familiar with the palace's approach. Instead, there was a quiet but unmistakable expectation that he would recognize the seriousness of what the evidence revealed and respond accordingly. Neutrality was increasingly viewed as untenable, not because anyone wanted to force Harry into an impossible choice, but because the nature of the crisis seemed to demand clarity about where everyone stood. The emotional toll on Harry during this period appears to have been severe. Royal observers who have tracked his public appearances and statements noted signs of strain that went beyond the typical pressures of royal life or media scrutiny. This was someone grappling with questions of fundamental identity. Who was he without the institution that had shaped his entire existence? Who was he within a marriage that now stood in direct opposition to that institution? Could these two parts of his identity coexist, or had the crisis made such coexistence impossible? Fear reportedly crept into Harry's thinking in ways it had not before. According to sources close to the situation, he became increasingly worried about being positioned as the weak link in the royal family, the point of vulnerability through which the conflict could expand and intensify. He understood how narratives work in the modern media environment, how blame and responsibility tend to flow toward whoever appears most uncertain or conflicted. The possibility that he might be framed as indecisive, manipulated, or lacking in loyalty to either side weighed heavily on him. This fear was not entirely unfounded. Media coverage was already beginning to focus intensely on Harry's position, with commentators speculating about his loyalties and questioning his judgment. Every public appearance was analysed for signs of which side he was leaning toward. Every statement, no matter how carefully worded, was dissected for hidden meanings and implications. The scrutiny only increased the pressure he felt to make a clear choice, even as that choice seemed impossible to make without devastating consequences. As the palace moved to contain the fallout from the DNA evidence, it quickly became apparent that containment had already failed. Despite strict protocols and limited access to sensitive information, details began leaking into the public sphere. These were not dramatic revelations or comprehensive disclosures, but rather fragments, small pieces of information that emerged through various channels. A confirmation from one source, a carefully worded denial from another, hints and suggestions that never quite provided full clarity but generated intense speculation nonetheless. The palace discovered what many institutions before it had learned. In the digital age, absolute secrecy is nearly impossible to maintain. Once a critical mass of people become aware of sensitive information, the odds of that information remaining completely contained drop dramatically. According to sources familiar with palace security protocols, there were no obvious breaches or intentional leaks by trusted insiders. Instead, information seemed to seep out through indirect channels, through people who had partial knowledge or who had heard things secondhand and passed them along without fully understanding the sensitivity involved. Media outlets sensed that something unprecedented was unfolding. Royal correspondents who had covered the family for years reported that the tone and intensity of their conversations with sources had changed noticeably. This was not another routine scandal or predictable family dispute. The language being used, the level of concern being expressed, and the reluctance of usually talkative sources to provide details all suggested something far more serious was developing behind palace walls. Headlines began to shift from speculation to urgency. Major news organizations that typically covered royal matters with a mix of reverence and mild gossip started assigning senior correspondents to the story. Analysis pieces replaced simple reporting, with royal experts and constitutional scholars being asked to weigh in on potential implications. The question was no longer whether something significant had happened, but rather how deep the crisis actually went and what it might mean for the monarchy's future. International reactions followed with surprising speed. Governments that maintained formal or informal relationships with the British monarchy began quietly reassessing their positions. According to diplomatic sources who spoke to various news outlets, there were discreet inquiries about the nature of the crisis and questions about whether it might affect the monarchy's stability or international standing. These were not hostile inquiries, but rather the natural response of institutions that relied on certain assumptions about British royal continuity and wanted to understand whether those assumptions still held. Public figures in various countries began commenting on the situation, some maintaining careful neutrality, while others subtly distanced themselves from either the monarchy or from Meghan and Harry. The global nature of modern celebrity and the international interest in the royal family meant that this was not simply a British matter. People around the world had formed opinions about the various parties involved, and those opinions influenced how the crisis was perceived and discussed across different cultures and contexts. The palace recognized that it faced a credibility crisis with genuinely global dimensions. This was not something that could be managed through traditional British media channels or contained within familiar institutional frameworks. The monarchy's symbolic importance and its role in various international relationships meant that how this crisis was handled would be observed and judged far beyond Britain's borders. Every statement, every action, and every silence would be interpreted through multiple cultural lenses and assessed according to different standards and expectations. As silence became increasingly untenable, the palace faced a stark choice. It could continue attempting to contain the situation through traditional means, hoping that public attention would eventually shift elsewhere and allow for quiet resolution. Or it could move more aggressively, taking control of the narrative before it was entirely shaped by outside forces and speculation. According to sources familiar with the strategic discussions during this period, the decision to escalate was driven largely by the recognition that passive approaches were no longer viable in the current media environment. The DNA evidence that triggered the crisis was never really about just one person or one relationship. According to sources within royal circles who have spoken to various journalists over recent months, the evidence threatened to expose something far more complex and far more dangerous to the institution than a simple dispute over credibility. What began as verification of specific claims quickly revealed patterns and inconsistencies that the palace had quietly managed for years, not out of malice, but out of a calculated determination to preserve institutional stability at almost any cost. For generations, the monarchy has operated on the principle that certain questions are better left unexamined. This is not unique to the British royal family, but rather a characteristic of many long-standing institutions that have survived by knowing when to look closely and when to look away. According to royal historians who have studied palace decision-making patterns, there has always been an informal understanding about which topics could be openly discussed and which required a kind of collective discretion. The DNA evidence threatened to violate that understanding by introducing objective verification into areas that had previously relied on accepted narratives and unspoken agreements. Palace insiders suggest that the evidence did not exist in isolation. It connected to other information, other timelines, other decisions that had been made over the years based on assumptions that now appeared questionable. The problem was not simply that one story might be contradicted, but that verification of one fact could trigger a cascade of questions about related matters. Each answer would demand further answers, and each revelation would make the next one harder to avoid. The palace found itself facing not a single crisis, but the potential for multiple interconnected crises that could overwhelm its capacity to manage them effectively. What made this particularly dangerous was the nature of institutional memory within the palace. According to former staffers who have discussed palace culture with various media outlets, there is an extensive informal knowledge network among long-serving employees and advisors. People know things without those things ever being formally documented or officially acknowledged. This system has worked well for maintaining continuity and protecting sensitive information, but it also means that once questions begin being asked, there are many people who possess pieces of larger puzzles, even if no single person holds all the pieces. The fear within the palace was that one verified exposure would not remain isolated. Sources familiar with internal discussions during this period describe a growing anxiety that challenging one accepted narrative would open the door to challenges of other narratives. The monarchy had survived by maintaining a certain level of ambiguity about various historical matters, allowing different interpretations to coexist without forcing definitive resolutions. The introduction of DNA evidence threatened this carefully maintained ambiguity by establishing that some questions actually did have definitive answers, and those answers could be determined through scientific means rather than institutional preference. For years, the palace had chosen continuity over confrontation when faced with internal inconsistencies. According to sources close to senior advisors, there had been moments over the past decades when certain discrepancies or contradictions had been noted but not pursued. The decision to overlook these matters was not necessarily about covering up wrongdoing, but rather about making practical judgments regarding what the institution could afford to examine too closely. Some questions, once answered, create problems larger than the problems they were meant to solve. This approach had worked reasonably well in an era when information could be more easily controlled and when public expectations about transparency were different. The palace could acknowledge certain facts while declining to explore their full implications, and this partial acknowledgement was generally accepted as sufficient. But the modern media environment and changing public attitudes toward institutional accountability had been steadily eroding the palace's ability to maintain this kind of selective transparency. The DNA evidence represented a breaking point where the old approach finally became unsustainable. The internal debate about how to respond reportedly exposed deep divisions within palace circles. Some advisors, according to sources who have discussed these deliberations, argued strongly for maintaining traditional approaches. They believed that acknowledging the evidence and its implications would cause more damage than simply absorbing whatever criticism came from refusing to engage. Their position was that the monarchy had survived previous crises by outlasting them by remaining silent and dignified, while critics eventually exhausted themselves or moved on to other targets. Others took the opposite view, arguing that silence was no longer protective, but rather complicit. According to insiders familiar with these discussions, this faction believed that the nature of DNA evidence meant that suppression would ultimately fail. The information would emerge eventually, either through leaks or through independent investigation, and when it did emerge without palace context or control, the damage would be far worse than if the institution confronted it directly and on its own terms. King Charles and his inner circle ultimately sided with the latter view, but the decision was reportedly agonizing and far from unanimous. What tipped the balance, according to sources close to the king's thinking, was the recognition that the institution's greatest vulnerability was not what the evidence revealed, but rather the accumulation of unaddressed truths that had built up over time. Each protected secret, each carefully managed inconsistency, each decision to prioritize comfort over clarity had created a kind of institutional fragility that made the monarchy more vulnerable to exposure, not less. The calculation became brutally simple. Which narratives could the palace afford to sacrifice in order to preserve the institution as a whole? Which relationships could be allowed to fracture without bringing down the entire structure? According to insiders, this represented a form of institutional triage that the monarchy had avoided for generations but could no longer escape. The DNA evidence forced a reckoning with the fact that not everything could be protected simultaneously, that choices would have to be made about what mattered most to the institution's survival. This was not a decision driven by personal animosity toward Meghan or anyone else involved in the immediate crisis. Sources close to the palace's strategic thinking emphasized that the response was fundamentally institutional rather than personal. The monarchy was reacting to a threat to its foundational credibility, to the narratives and assumptions that allowed it to function as a relevant institution in the modern world. Individual relationships and personal feelings, however important in other contexts, became secondary to questions of institutional preservation. What made the moment particularly chilling for those involved was the clarity it brought about the monarchy's priorities. The palace was willing to accept significant personal costs, damaged relationships, and public criticism if those were the prices of maintaining institutional integrity. This represented a departure from the more flexible and accommodating approach that had characterized recent decades of royal family management. The institution was drawing lines, establishing boundaries, and signaling that some challenges would be met with force rather than accommodation. The secret that the DNA evidence threatened to expose was not necessarily a single dramatic revelation, but rather a web of interconnected information that could unravel in unpredictable ways once the first thread was pulled. According to sources familiar with palace concerns, the worry was not about any one specific fact becoming public, but about losing control of the narrative entirely, about entering a period where the institution was constantly reacting to new revelations rather than proactively managing its own story. Time became the enemy in this scenario. Every day of delay increased the likelihood that information would emerge through channels the palace could not control. Every attempt at traditional management strategies seemed to increase suspicion rather than allay it. The monarchy found itself in a position where acting decisively, even if that meant accepting short-term damage, appeared less risky than continuing to hope that containment would somehow work, despite all evidence to the contrary. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, those closest to the situation came to understand that there was no path back to the status quo. The DNA evidence had not created the underlying problems, but had made them impossible to continue ignoring. The palace could no longer choose which truths to protect without that act of protection itself becoming part of the story. The institution's attempt to manage information had become as much a part of the crisis as the information itself. What remained unclear, even to insiders, was how far the revelations might ultimately extend. The DNA evidence answered certain specific questions, but raised many others. It established facts that contradicted accepted narratives, but it also hinted at complexities and connections that had not yet been fully explored. The palace was navigating territory where each answer generated new questions, where verification of one claim led to uncertainty about related claims, and where the full scope of what might eventually emerge remained genuinely unknown. This uncertainty drove much of the urgency behind the palace's response. The institution was racing against the possibility that someone else, whether investigative journalists or other interested parties, might obtain similar evidence or ask similar questions. Once that happened, the palace would lose whatever remaining control it had over how information was revealed and contextualized. The decision to confront the crisis directly was driven partly by the recognition that waiting meant surrendering the initiative entirely. The monarchy had chosen survival over sentiment, institutional preservation over personal comfort, and long-term credibility over short-term peace. Those choices carried consequences that were beginning to manifest even as the full crisis continued to unfold. Relationships that had been strained now appeared broken beyond repair. Trust that had been damaged now seemed irretrievable. The institution had committed itself to a course from which there was no easy retreat, accepting that the cost of action, however high, was still lower than the cost of inaction in the face of evidence that demanded response.